I live in a quaint neighborhood in the suburbs, the kind where people smile and wave as they water their lawns, where the loudest sound you hear after dark is the hum of crickets. The year was 2015, and I had just settled into my new home, a modest two-bedroom house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It was everything I had hoped for, peaceful, friendly, and safe. Or so I thought. It was a typical Tuesday night, and I had just finished watching the late-night news. I shut off the TV, locked the front door, and headed to bed. The house was still and silent, save for the occasional creak of the settling floorboards. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt that comforting sense of security that comes with knowing you're safe in your own home. Then, just past midnight, I was jolted awake by a sound that set my heart racing, a loud, deliberate knock on the front door. It was an odd hour for visitors, and my immediate thought was that something was terribly wrong. I glanced at the clock on my bedside table, 12:34 a.m. I lay there for a moment, straining to hear any other sounds. Perhaps it was a one-off knock, a prank, or maybe I had imagined it. But then, it came again. 3 slow, methodical knocks. Each one resonated through the quiet house, sending chills down my spine. I threw off the covers and got out of bed, my bare feet sinking into the carpet. Grabbing my phone from the nightstand, I turned on the flashlight and tiptoed down the hallway, the beam cutting through the darkness. The house seemed eerily different at night, shadows stretching into unfamiliar shapes. As I approached the front door, I noticed the porch light was still on, casting a pale glow through the small window above the door. I took a deep breath and peered through the peephole, expecting to see someone there, but to my surprise, there was no one. The porch was empty, the street beyond deserted. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, debating whether to open the door. What if it was a trap? What if someone was hiding, waiting for me to unlock it? The logical part of my brain told me to go back to bed, to ignore it. But curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I unlocked the deadbolt and cracked the door open, peeking out into the night. The cool air hit my face, but there was no one there. I stepped outside, looking up and down the street. The only sound was the distant hum of a passing car. Feeling foolish, I closed the door and locked it again, double-checking the deadbolt. I turned off the porch light and headed back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house seemed amplified, every shadow more sinister. Just as I was beginning to drift off again, the knock came once more, louder this time, more insistent. I shot up, heart racing. This was no figment of my imagination. Someone was out there, playing some kind of sick game. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking. The operator answered, and I explained the situation as calmly as I could. She assured me that a patrol car would be there soon and advised me to stay inside and keep all the doors and windows locked. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone clutched in my hand, eyes fixed on the bedroom door. Minutes felt like hours, and then I heard it, the sound of a car pulling up outside. I hurried to the window and peered through the blinds, relief washing over me as I saw the police cruiser. There was a knock on the door again, but this time it was followed by a reassuring voice announcing it was the police. I let them in, explaining the strange occurrences. They searched the property, finding no signs of anyone having been there. The officers left, promising to patrol the area throughout the night. I thanked them and locked the door behind them. As I crawled back into bed, the adrenaline slowly faded, leaving me exhausted. Morning came, bringing with it a sense of normalcy. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and the unsettling events of the night felt like a distant memory. But a nagging feeling remained, a creeping sense of unease that would not go away. I never did find out who knocked on my door that night, or why. But from that day on, I never felt quite as safe in my little house at the end of the cul-de-sac.
In 2015, I moved into a modest home in a sleepy suburb. The neighborhood was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where kids played in the street until the sun set, and the most excitement you got was the occasional garage sale. It was the perfect place to start fresh after a messy breakup, offering the peace and quiet I desperately needed. Or so I thought. One Friday night, after a long week at work, I decided to unwind with a movie. I had just finished watching a horror flick, something about a relentless monster stalking its prey. The credits rolled, and I chuckled at my own nervousness. Real life was never that scary. I turned off the TV, locked the door, and headed to bed, feeling a sense of relief as I burrowed under the covers. Just after midnight, I was startled awake by a noise I couldn't immediately place. I lay still, straining to listen, when I heard it again, a deep, heavy thud against the front door. I sat up, heart racing, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it a prank? A drunk neighbor? I glanced at my phone, 12:17 a.m. I crept out of bed and into the hallway, the wooden floors cold under my feet. Grabbing my phone for its flashlight, I moved cautiously toward the door. The thudding continued, each knock more forceful than the last, shaking the door in its frame. Whoever was out there was determined. I hesitated, debating whether to call the police. Instead, I peeked through the peephole, expecting to see someone, but I wasn't prepared for what I saw. Standing on my porch was a man, easily 6.5 feet tall, with broad shoulders that seemed to fill the entire doorway. He was wearing a dark coat, the collar turned up, partially obscuring his face. His eyes, cold and piercing, stared directly at the peephole, as if he knew I was watching. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound confident. No response. Just that unblinking stare. Then he spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the door. "Let me in," he said. I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you want?" "Let me in," he repeated, more insistent this time. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. This was no ordinary visitor. I dialed 911, my fingers shaking as I explained the situation to the dispatcher. She assured me that a patrol car was on its way and advised me to stay on the line. As I waited, the man continued to knock, each blow sending a jolt of fear through me. I retreated to the kitchen, grabbing a knife from the drawer, feeling a bit foolish but needing the comfort of something tangible to defend myself with. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, the flashing lights of a police car lit up the windows. The knocking stopped abruptly. I crept back to the front door and looked through the peephole again. The man was gone, vanished into the night. The officers knocked, and I quickly let them in, explaining everything in a rush of words. They searched the property and the surrounding area, but found no sign of the man. No footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. It was as if he had never existed. The police left, promising to keep an eye on the neighborhood. I locked the door behind them, triple-checking the deadbolt. Exhausted but unable to sleep, I sat in the living room, clutching the knife, listening to the silence, every creak of the house setting my nerves on edge. Morning came, bringing a sense of relief but also a lingering unease. I couldn't shake the image of that man, his cold eyes staring through the peephole. I asked around the neighborhood, but no one had seen anything unusual. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to put the incident behind me, but every time I approached my front door, I felt a shiver of fear. I never saw the man again, but his presence lingered, a shadow over my peaceful life. My safe haven no longer felt safe, and I couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if I had opened the door.
In the summer of 2015, I moved into a charming old house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, hoping to find some peace and a sense of community. The street was lined with tall, ancient trees, their leaves rustling in the wind, and the houses, though old, had a certain timeless charm. Everything seemed perfect until the wailing began. It started on my third night in the house. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard the unmistakable sound of a baby crying. At first, I thought nothing of it. Babies cry, it's what they do. I figured it was my neighbor's child and tried to ignore it. But the crying didn't stop. It went on for hours, a piercing, mournful wail that echoed through the stillness of the night. The next day, I decided to introduce myself to my neighbors. They were a young couple, the Johnsons, who had moved in a few months before me. When I mentioned the crying, they looked at each other with a strange expression before Mr. Johnson said, "Yes, that's our baby, Timmy. He's been having a rough time lately. We're sorry if it disturbed you." I assured them it was no problem, but as I walked back to my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That night, the crying started again, even louder and more desperate than before. I tried to drown it out with music, but nothing worked. I lay awake, listening to the heart-wrenching sobs until the early hours of the morning. Days turned into weeks, and the crying persisted. It was relentless, happening at all hours, and it was driving me to the edge. I spoke to other neighbors, hoping for some reassurance, but their reactions were unsettling. They avoided the topic, quickly changing the subject whenever I brought it up. One particularly sleepless night, I decided to investigate. I couldn't understand how the Johnsons were coping with this constant noise. As I crept out into my backyard, I could see their house, dimly lit, the silhouette of a small figure moving behind a window. The crying was louder out here, more intense. It didn't sound like a baby anymore, it was too mournful, too haunting. I crept closer to the fence that separated our yards, trying to get a better look. Suddenly, the crying stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, I saw her, Mrs. Johnson, standing by the window, staring directly at me. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. She raised a finger to her lips, signaling for me to be quiet, and then she was gone. The next day, I knocked on the Johnsons' door. Mr. Johnson answered, looking haggard and worn. "Is everything all right?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He hesitated before replying, "It's Timmy. He's been very sick." I pressed further, sensing there was more to the story. "Is there anything I can do to help?" He shook his head. "No, thank you. We're managing." That night, the crying returned, more anguished than ever. I couldn't take it anymore. I called the police, worried that something terrible was happening in that house. They arrived quickly, knocking on the Johnsons' door, but when they emerged, their faces were grim. "There's no baby," one of the officers said to me. "The Johnsons lost their child months ago." A cold chill ran down my spine. "But the crying?" The officer looked troubled. "They said it's the baby's spirit. They've been hearing it ever since he died." I was stunned, unable to comprehend what I was hearing. That night, as the crying started once more, I lay in bed, unable to move, paralyzed by fear and sorrow. The wails seemed to seep through the walls, filling my room with their unbearable sadness. Days later, the Johnsons moved out, unable to bear the haunting cries any longer. The house stood empty, silent, but I could still hear the baby's wails at night, a ghostly reminder of the sorrow that lingered in the shadows of our neighborhood. No one ever moved into that house again, and the crying eventually stopped, but the memory of those nights stayed with me, a chilling reminder of the grief and the unknown that lurks just beyond our understanding.